Jewish foreign policy. What is a Jewish foreign policy? It means recognizing that the diaspora, putting aside the normative relationship, is a fundamental source of Israeli national security. And that means taking into account diaspora Jewish concerns. Most of diaspora Jewry is conservative and reform. How can the Jewish state not recognize it?
Right.
What about the Kotel? What about not right of return,
Right of prayer.
no right of prayer? Okay, these are first of all domestic Israeli issues that have to be resolved. But we have to work it out. We have to take into account diaspora concerns. There's more.
What else?
The relationship with the United States is, as I said, I think just about the most important thing. Now let me tell you a couple of questions that I posted in the book and I raised in talks in the last year in the Israeli National Security Council, in the IDF. And I said to the audience, I said, sit carefully in your seats because I don't want anybody to fall out and get injured. The first question isn't so big. It's has the price of an extraordinary relationship with the United States been that Israel's lost a large part of its national independence? Not completely, a fair amount. And I believe that the answer is yes. There are some smart people who disagree with me on that. Let me finish in 2 minutes. It looked like you're raising a hand. There are some smart people who disagree with me on that. I believe there's a clear case. The bigger question, though, is, can Israel even survive today without the United States? Now, I don't know the answer to that. In desperate circumstances, people find desperate solutions. So the answer is maybe. Well, the guys in the IDF and the National Security Council, when I posed that question, everybody sort of nodded, oh yeah, no big surprise in your question. Well, if that's the case, where's the relationship heading? I don't foresee ever a France 1967 kind of downturn. There are pillars of support in the United States that are too strong. So it's not going to be this. But I think we're actually already in this. And I think that the Trump administration is the exception to the rule. It's the aberration. What we saw beginning under Obama is the long-term trend because there are fundamental tectonic changes in American demography. There are rises, there are new population groups that are rising in the United States. Hispanics and the religiously unaffiliated, the two most rapidly rising groups, they have no affiliation for Israel. In the Jewish community, increasing distancing from Israel. And let me tell you something, I am normally a relatively patient and tolerant person. When I hear American Jews, including some very prominent ones in the especially last half year, including on the editorial pages of the New York Times, coming out and disengaging themselves from the state of Israel and expressing disaffection from the state of Israel, I have a suggestion for what they could go and do to themselves. 70 years after the Holocaust, 5 years after the Holocaust, 70 years after Israel's establishment, you can disagree with Israeli policy. It's all legitimate. I disagree with a lot of it, vocally. There's disagreement out of love, and there's something else.
Family matter.
So if we are so dependent, and the long-term trends, as a matter of fact, the medium-term trends are not so good, what should Israel be doing about that? Well, I have some recommendations for what we should do. I think that Israel has to maintain the ability to strike the Iranian nuclear program at any time, if and when we have exhausted all diplomatic options. We're not there yet. I think that Mr. Trump made a historic error in withdrawing from the agreement. Not because it was a wonderful agreement, but because it was, I believe, the best of the bad alternatives we faced. And I believe that we are worse off without the agreement. And had there not been the agreement, Iran could have crossed the nuclear threshold in the meantime. And now imagine, even if they hadn't done it yet, they could do it now. in the next year. And imagine that we had to deal, for example, with the northern front. Only Iran's got nuclear in the meantime. And I said before, if Iran goes nuclear, we have to take into account that there will be a cascading effect and additional states will go nuclear as well. Well, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, the three likely kind of candidates, all happen to be American allies with some degree of an American guarantee for the, I said Turkey, some degree of an American guarantee for their security. NATO, as Turkey is a NATO member. So can Israel attack nuclear programs? Can Israel attack nuclear programs in these countries? Tough question. Well, if not, what do we do? Again, this is a decade or so away at worst. What do we do? Well, do we have to start thinking Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity? Do we adopt an explicit posture? Do we seek a defense treaty with the United States? Do we start thinking about what sounds totally fanciful at this time, which is regional WMD disarmament? At least begin thinking about it now. At least for the meantime, and I think beyond that, Israel should maintain the policy of nuclear ambiguity. I believe it's been a remarkable success. The entire world is convinced that Israel is nuclear, whether it is or is not. And so Israel enjoys all of the benefits of an explicit declaratory policy without paying the price. So let me conclude with two final recommendations. Some people may say, what does this have to do with national security? And I would say everything. The first is I think we have to amend the electoral system. It has been, I believe, the source of many of the difficulties that we have faced in recent decades. There is no such thing as a perfect electoral system. Maybe not everyone in this room is thrilled with the results that the American system has produced in recent years. I'm not just saying Mr. Trump. You might be aware, you might not have liked some of the others before him. I said, I'm not just talking about Trump, who was a controversial president. And I'm not sure that the British system has produced such wonderful results today, or anywhere else. But I believe that some changes have to be made so that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet can usually expect to govern for a full 4-year term. This is actually the first coalition in Israel's history which I think is going to live out its full 4-year term. And changes have to be made to make the Cabinet more responsive to the Prime Minister and the Knesset more accountable to the people. The Supreme Court is fine. And finally, I think we have to take measures to ensure the long-term resolve and resilience of Israeli society. Contrary to various other analysts, I think actually Israel's society has proven to be a huge national asset. Huge resilience, huge staying power. I think it's quite remarkable. I think when you really look at it, the national consensus, the national security consensus, with the one exception of the Palestinian issue, and it's a big exception, of course, is almost complete on all other issues. Even on the Palestinian issue, when you parse it, the differences are far narrower than most people believe. There is a 90-something% majority in Israel against a one-state solution. There is still a small majority for a two-state solution, and that's after 20 years of not much of a peace process. I have no doubt that if tomorrow there was a realistic possibility for a two-state solution, the numbers would go back to the old 2/3 majority. Most, an overwhelming majority, are against unbridled settlement. Everyone wants to prevent Iran from going nuclear. Everybody understands the importance of the relationship with the United States. On most of the other issues, there's agreement. And again, on the Palestinian issue, the disagreement is not as broad as people believe. The real disagreements are on the domestic issues. Secular, religious, Jewish, Arab. So I think we have to declare a war on poverty and develop a long-term Israeli strategy. You can never eliminate poverty completely, and poverty, of course, is always relative. But so that 20 years from now, we have essentially eliminated it, and I think with a targeted strategy, this is not beyond Israel's capability. So let me just conclude by saying there's some tsulas out there, right? There's still a lot of trouble, but at age 70, I think we've done very well. We have a great deal to be proud about and happy with. And now there's some disagreement in the room, so just maybe we keep the first
I'm curious to know what you think would incentivize the Palestinians to agree to a one-state, a two-state, whatever state solution, because right now it seems that they have the best of both worlds
or the worst of every world.
or the
They don't
worst.
want it. They don't want this solution. There's a man named Freilich.
Excuse me, my question was,
Let me just comment on your question.
wait until
There is a
later.
man named Barghouti who is in Israeli jail for killing 30 people. His cousin, Freilich Barghouti, is the leader of this tribe. He has said to me over lunch in a lovely restaurant in Ramallah that if Israel will continue to keep the foot upon the neck, the Palestinians will at one point say, fine, one state. Oh, Israel, send us a school. I'm quoting, Israel, send us a road. We want a hospital. If a one-state solution is imposed upon these two people forever, there will not be two states. There will not be a Jewish state. There will be a demographically controlled, Arab-ish, Jewish-ish
Is there a
state.
question now? Thank you
And the
for
question is, how do we make the public, including those in this room, including those who would sit and say, one state and will somehow, by demographic, whatever,
Let me try and answer the question.
Carolyn, Blake, and
Let me try and
excuse
answer.
me,
I
the
think
question, what my question was not answered, and it was not addressed to you.
For your
Could
question,
you please
please
answer
go.
it?
Okay. I think you're asking the wrong question.
Okay.
Let me put it bluntly. I couldn't give a damn about the Palestinians. They can all drop dead tomorrow and start okay? I don't really mean that. I'm not such a nasty person. They've suffered. I don't like to see anybody suffer. I think they have earned their suffering honestly. They have rejected every possible solution. I don't care about them. I care about us. Okay? What do we do to ensure Israel's future? That's the only question for us. And I gave you before a statistics which should have gotten you very unhappy, which is that it is today 60-40. Without Gaza and with Gaza, it's already 50%, maybe 51%. And in 5 years from now, it will definitely be 51%. Now, is 60-40 a Jewish state? Is that why we went and reestablished our national sovereignty after 2,000 years for 60-40? No. And the answer is no. And if that's what we're going to be, that's called a binational state. We know history has been good to us. It's given us the opportunity to see a pre-run, not a rerun, but a pre-run. A binational state in the Middle East is called Syria. It's called Iraq. Is that what we want? Now, I'm not political, I don't care right, left, but Israel's right is leading us to a future of Iraq and Syria, and the violence that we have today, that we've had for decades, the terrorism, is partly an initial sign of what it's going to look like. The terrorism is, the left is,
Or non-state.
no, the solution is to separate from the Palestinians. Okay? Believe me, I'm an expert on the peace process, okay? I said before, I don't think we can reach an agreement with the Palestinians, which is why I think we have to start taking unilateral measures. The IDF remains deployed to ensure security, but we start creating a de facto two-state solution. And one of the problems, again, Jews don't like to hear good news, and we have a good reason for always fearing the worst. Military commanders, most of Israel's defense establishment believes that we can reach security arrangements. They won't be perfect, but that will ensure Israel's security in a two-state solution. Okay? So there's a fundamental question here. There's no absolute answer. It's normative. Everybody has to make the decision for themselves. But don't be quite so afraid of the security ramifications. They're important. We have to handle them. They're critical. We're not going anywhere without them. But we also have to preserve our character as a state.
Okay, my question is, if past performance is indicative of future success, okay? We gave away Gaza, they used it for a launching pad for all intents and purposes. And I was wondering if you see the Lifeline maps, you know, the maps,
Which one?
Mark
Oh, yeah.
Lifeline. Okay, that if that happened, then the airport's strategic, most of Israel's population centers would be a direct target line of the West Bank.
It already is. I know the maps, I don't need his maps. Most of Israel is already in Hamas range, and essentially all of Israel is in the Hezbollah range. Now, we can't allow that to happen in the West Bank. The way the unilateral withdrawal was done from Gaza as a unilateral withdrawal was not the way it should have been done. Again, even if we get the best security arrangements, they won't be perfect. There's the danger. We will have the ability then to go in and we'll know what we're fighting for. The people of Israel will know what they're fighting for, and we'll go in and we'll crush them. Because the Palestinians...
in Gaza, we have 3 wars.
Now, the difference is that there was no peace agreement. The difference is that we didn't get security agreements. And the difference is that the Hamas threat is not a big threat. It's really not. And it's just not worth handling it. We can go into Gaza any time. Do you know how many guys we're going to lose doing that? Hundreds. Hundreds. So why? Look, if I lived in Nachal Oz, right on the border, I might feel a little bit differently.
All Israel is on the border.
I live in Israel. I live in Israel, okay?
I did too. So.
Good. I'm telling you that this is not a significant military threat for Israel. It is very unpleasant if you live right around Gaza, the so-called Otef. But it's not a military threat. It's unpleasant.
If we give them a country, that they would be Palestinian country and not Iranian country? Can you secure
No,
that?
that's a good question.
They would be an Iranian.
That's a good point.
because
No, you don't know
Palestinians
that.
have no power.
You don't know that, but that is a
I
reasonable...
see what happened in Gaza,
Okay.
and we see what's going to be. Who's guaranteed? UN is going to...
No, we are. We are.
How?
In the same way that...
They have autonomy. They have the country, they have the people.
No, they don't have...
All they don't
the
have
country.
is security because we have to get there.
No,
to
they
get
live under
there.
occupation. They've lived under occupation for 50 years. There is...
That's what we call it. I call it autonomy. They have everything they need.
They do have... No, that's you say. They do have autonomy over, or domestic rule over social issues. They live under occupation, an increasingly brutal occupation, and if you don't recognize that, you are blind. And I would like to see you, if you lived in a situation in which foreign soldiers, they're our soldiers, we love them, but for them there are foreign soldiers bursting into people's home at 3 in the morning.
Yeah. Otherwise, how will we take the terrorists? We'll say,
I
oh,
didn't-
we are coming.
I didn't say-
Please open the door.
I said-
Yes, that's how we...
Yes, now understand, you're right, now understand them. Life isn't just about your side. Okay, ma'am, I'm not going to engage in an argument with you. You asked a question, you got an answer. I think the answer is we have to ensure our character and our security. And I believe that since the security isn't so wonderful today, we have to find ways of achieving reasonable security afterwards. Sir.
I agree with almost everything that you said, but I have 3 specific little pieces. Internally in Iran, is there any kind of sense that there's a movement to destabilize the regime? Secondly, the likelihood that the Sunni coalition, it seems, fostering a relationship with Israel, is that, do you really have faith that that can be sustained? And finally, I don't see any will on the part of the Israeli government to move anything close to the direction. Forget militarily.
To move?
In the direction of creating a more peaceful approach, to more constructive approach, given what you presented as a very strong operating position.
Okay, the first question about stability in Iran. Yeah, first of all, the answer is no one really knows what's going on. The Arab Spring actually began in Iran in 2009. There were mass demonstrations that they put down in June '09. And it's clear that there's a lot of unrest under the surface, and it's also clear that a substantial portion, it's a minority, but it's a substantial minority of the population still supports the Islamic Republic. And I tend to think that it's one of those situations where they'll be perfectly stable, out of power, just overnight. Or it'll happen without us expecting it. I think the administration has greatly overstated the impact of the sanctions. They aren't nearly as powerful as the sanctions were in 2012. Yes, it's causing a lot of pain there. I don't think it's enough to destabilize the regime, at least for the foreseeable future. Then you asked about the coalition with the Sunni states. I don't know how long it's going to last. How long does anything last? History is changing all the time. It's a dramatic change in the strategic picture. For as long as it's there, it's good. It's not because they fell in love with us. It's because of a common enemy called Iran. That enemy is going to be there for a while, so it will last for a while, and who knows? The fact that the Saudi crown prince can talk about recognizing Israel's right to exist, maybe we can have relations with Saudi Arabia. Before Sadat came to Jerusalem, nobody believed we would have peace with Egypt, and we've now had a stable peace with Egypt for 40 years. And your final question was, you pointed out correctly that the current Israeli government has absolutely no intention of making any of the concessions needed for an agreement. That's true. And the May government, the smart money is still on Mr. Netanyahu winning. That may or not be the case. I believe that if he is reelected, he will not last out more than another year. I think because of his legal problems. His chances of being in office much more than about a year are poor, and as a matter of fact, at least one of the potential coalition partners has already said that he will not remain in a coalition in which the Prime Minister is under indictment. So as a matter of fact, only one person has said it of the coalition partners. So there will be a different government, one way or the other, probably in the current year. Probably still be Likud. Yes.
Have you taken into consideration General Habibi's Sinai plan?
What's General Habibi's Sinai? Oh, the multilateral? Are you talking about the multilateral swap?
That Israel and America acquire from Egypt, who needs money, the Sinai, and make that.
Okay. You know something? I haven't heard it, and that's pure nonsense. That is so baseless. Anyone who thinks that Egypt is going to sell the Sinai for any sum of money, for every penny on earth, has no understanding whatsoever of Egypt, and I'm not even going to. I won't comment beyond that. It's nonsense, ma'am. That is not a proposal. That is pure fantasy. I'm not going to waste my time. I know something about the Mideast. That is beyond being worth even thinking about.
You mentioned you want Americans to have more of a say, or you think it's a good idea for Americans to have more of a say?
I didn't say that. I said Israel has to take into account.
Okay. Do you realize that Americans have, non-Orthodox American Jews have a 70% plus rate of intermarriage? And if the conversion standards are changed, the identity of who is a Jew in Israel is going to be so maligned, and it's going to affect the Jewish population and who is a Jew. So, do you think, like, long-term, it's really wise to take non-Orthodox Jews seriously?
Absolutely. I think anyone who is crazy enough to want to be Jewish is a Jew. And I don't care if it's halakha, not halakha. If you are crazy enough to want to be Jewish, you're Jewish.
But that the rabbis don't agree with that.
Some rabbis agree and some don't. And the ones who disagree, I have a disagreement with. That's fine. Yes, ma'am.
So, in other words, forgive me, I don't know all their names, but there are 3 women who are now in Congress. One is from Michigan, and the Octavia Perez, who's now Jewish, she says, and then there's another one who organized the Women's March. So they sound a lot like some of what you're saying, that if Israel will be nice, then we'll make peace with them. So do you agree with these women? And their
First of all, I don't think what they're saying is anything that the whole night saying. And it's not a question of being nice. I think that the reason that we don't have peace is because the Palestinians have repeatedly rejected dramatic proposals for peace.
They have no intention from the women to the
And I don't know if there's any peace agreement that the Palestinians will ever sign. Okay? I don't, with the exception of right of return, there is no area in which there's much more that Israel could give, because we already offered everything except for right of return. Okay? And that's why I'm saying I don't care about the Palestinians. I care about Israel. We cannot remain a truly Jewish and democratic state
Yes, we are.
if we can, in the long run, if we are in control of the West Bank. It's 60-40. That's not a Jewish state. If it's going to be 60-40, then I can tell you I might as well conduct reverse aliyah, because what's the point? If you want to live just in a democratic society, the United States isn't bad. It's a relatively pleasant place to live, right? And you can even live in Japan, fine. You can live a nice Jewish life in the United States. The reason Israel's raison d'etre was to be a Jewish, predominantly Jewish and democratic state. That is jeopardizing our national security in the worst way. There is no solution to that. People come up with cockamamie ideas for how to get around it. The fact is, after 50 years, believe me, I'm open to new and creative ideas. Because I don't think we can reach a two-state solution, at least for the foreseeable future, maybe ever. But then the question is, what do we do? How do we ensure our national character, our security? And we've got to find a way. And if we have to take measures on our own while ensuring our security, so be it.
You've pointed out very, very important problems in Israel, and I think the devil is in the solutions. I agree that to just do what we think is best is and the hell with what they want to do is probably the most logical thing. But the problem always arises in the fact that you said that the soldiers are there and it's all that bad. But without the soldiers there, and if you don't have the ability to go where the terrorists are, because now you've isolated yourself.
I said the IDF remains deployed. The IDF remains deployed throughout the West Bank for security purposes, and we can do.
But that's part of what they're so upset about.
They can be upset. I've got the power today. The state of Israel has the power to determine its course. We can decide that we're beginning to withdraw the settlers, but Tzahal remains deployed. Okay? The IDF remains exactly where it believes it should be. Where it is today, where it wants to be, wherever it wants. But the international community now knows that Israel is committed to two states because we've started to provide encouragement, economic inducements to people to return, because we've announced that we're not settling anymore outside of the blocks. By the way, I would go a step further. I would actually renounce any claim to anything beyond the fence line, which is about 10% of the West Bank, but not all the people that I associate with agree with that one. But Tzahal remains wherever it has to be for defensive purposes. So you haven't increased your risk. You've begun creating, doesn't matter, you probably increase it a little bit, but you begin creating a two-state reality.
So the thing is that, do you think that you're going to really make the enemies of Israel, with all the problems that's going on with the BDS, and you think that you're going to make them happy? I mean, part of this is but part of this to make them is
no. I don't want to make it. I don't want to. Well, yes, of course. One of the objectives, yes, to lower tension.
To lower the tension.
But I don't want to make anybody happy.
No. So to lower the tension, but do you think you're going to lower the tension because you don't have any settlers, but you have the IDF there?
Yeah.
You're not going to lower the.
Yeah.
In today's day and age, the people who are fighting against Israel in the campuses and all that stuff, the IDF being there, I'm here, you're there. I don't know what you know over there, but here, that's not going to do it for them. It's going to continue. We're not going to win that war with that solution. Although I agree with that solution, but we're not going to win the war with that solution because it's gone beyond that.
Okay. First of all, the primary problem in Israel's standing around the world, including in the United States, is the West Bank, is the settlement issue. Okay? The international community does not accept the settlement enterprise. Okay? After 50 years, we can say that. Good. As a matter of fact, half the people of Israel don't accept it. Good.
Fine.
Now,
But
we're not going to
if-
solve the problems. There is always going to be strong anti-Israel sentiment in the Arab world. There will be some anti-Israel sentiment no matter what we do around the world. Some of it is anti-Semitic, a lot of it is not. It is simply disagreement with the policy. I'm not out for a perfect solution. We can't solve all of the problems. By doing this, we will mitigate the problem you're raising. We won't solve it. And we address our problem. Okay? That's what I want to do.
Does a two-state solution unequivocally state that no Arabs live in Israel? Because if you have Arabs still living in Israel, then we have a demographic problem.
No, no. No. Okay. All right, you have to know some of the data. You have to know some of the data. Israel's population itself is 20% non-Jewish, 19 Muslim, 1% Christian. 20%. When I said 40, that's because it includes the West Bank. So the minute you separate from the West Bank, you've solved half of the demographic problem. That's not enough. My problem is that I don't know how we resolve the domestic Israeli demographic problem. But there's no way we can solve it while we're still in control of the West Bank. Now, Israeli Arab birth rates have plummeted dramatically.
Except the Bedouin.
Guys, you can come up with you can come up with some little point about everything. No, it's a little point because the overall Israeli Arab birth rates have plummeted. As a matter of fact, the average birth rate of the Muslim population today is exactly the same as the secular Jewish birth rate. Not Chassidim, the secular Jewish. Okay. And that trend will probably continue because that's the international trend. The better educated women become, the more they work, the fewer kids they have. Okay. But that's 80-20. The 80-20 has been there for decades. Is that the Jewish state that Herzl envisioned, the 80-20? I'm not sure. But that's something that everybody in Israel has become comfortable with over the decades. I don't think anyone is comfortable with the 60-40. Now, there are differences over how to resolve the problem, but nobody is comfortable with 60-40. And I don't think we should be, because that's not a Jewish state.
I understand the threat of a nuclear Iran, but a non-nuclear Iran, is that really that big a threat? Iraq defeated Iran in their civil war.
They didn't defeat us.
It was standoff, okay. But Iraq was one of the armies that attacked Israel, one of the 7 armies. So Israel defeated Iraq. So, plus the fact that Iraq was, you talked about the home front, I remember the Scuds from Iraq. So I'm not sure on what basis are you saying Iran is such, a non-nuclear Iran is such a threat?
But they are nuclear. They are.
Well,
No, they're not. And
They are.
no, they're not. You're simply
That's what
factually
they
wrong.
tell you.
No, you're factually wrong. They are not a nuclear power, and they are at best a few years
So
away.
they would be in 10 years, how about that?
They've been, ma'am, it's so easy to yell out slogans where you don't really know the facts. They've been
Yes,
working.
I do.
No, you don't. They've been working for 30 years and they're still not there. So it's not so easy.
I know
Okay.
it's much.
Good. The question was, okay, the question was about, excuse me, the question was about the non-nuclear Iran, why I consider it to be such a major threat. First of all, Iran's got a population of about 80 million people. By Middle Eastern standards, well-educated, sophisticated, advanced. Iran is a serious place. It's not Saddam's Iraq, which is a one-man insane asylum, where the entire country was one man's decision. Iran's got a real decision-making process. Khamenei doesn't make the decision. There are lots of competing power centers within the regime. They have to get people to agree. They have to build internal coalitions, which, by the way, limits how radical their policy is. It would be even worse. Most of the people in Iran are sick and tired of the Islamic Republic. Okay. And eventually, I think, things will change. But Iran is a big and advanced country with incredible oil wealth. Very carefully calculating, they set out a plan. And they've been working on it for a few decades. They're willing to work for another few decades. They don't mind. They're putting a lot of money and efforts into it. they gave Hezbollah 130, maybe more, 130,000 rockets. That didn't come from nowhere. This is a threat that we've never faced before, and it's continuing. And now they're trying to do something very similar in Syria. Now imagine that it becomes 200,000 and then 300,000 rockets, and it's two fronts. And the effort was to build up a force of 100,000 militia in Syria, in addition to Hezbollah, in addition to rockets. And they're far away. So when their forces are right on the border, we've been hitting them successfully so far. Again, it's a losing battle long run, I believe. But they're far away. So again, I sleep quite well. We'll handle them. But I think it's harder than it was with the Arab countries in the past.
Just switching gears for a moment. No one has a crystal ball, but I was just wondered if you feel Israel might be a little concerned in the next presidential election if we get, the country seems, and the Democratic Party seems to be turning left. The left does not seem to be, unfortunately, a friend to Israel. If Israel is starting to worry about their funding, can we count on America? Does Israel feel we can count on the U.S. to support financially and internationally?
First of all, I think most of the viable Democratic candidates that I can think of are pro-Israel. And most of them are. And before there's a significant downturn, I think a lot of time will go by. In any event, we have the 10-year package now. That's already assigned here. Could it be violated? Yeah, but I don't think that's the question. I think what we are going to start seeing, as I said before, and this depends who the next president is, a Trump or a Democrat, it doesn't matter. I think we've peaked. I think the relationship peaked either under Clinton or Bush 2. And again, I think at the moment there's a temporary harmony, but I think it hides the long-term problem. But I don't think we're not in for a crisis. And by the way, chas v'chalila, God forbid something happened, Israel can live quite nicely without the 3.8 billion. Okay, it's 1% of the GDP. It's about 3% of the state budget. Now, go and cut a national state budget by 3%. That's very hard. The political constituency involved, the screaming and shouting in Israel would be enormous. But it's not something that we can't handle if we have to. Is there something to say? The biggest problem is, you're right, the biggest issue isn't the money, it's the support in a whole variety of other areas. You're right. Okay, so you'll be next.
A comment about the current support of Israel from the Sunni states. It's something that's been going on for a very, very, very long time. There's been contact between Israel and the Sunni states that I personally know about,
Not
at
public.
least since the 90s, when David Rubin was sitting here as economic consul, and there was a need to contact certain ministers in the Sunni states. He picked up his phone. He had all the numbers. It's not new.
So what's your question?
It's just more public. The question.
No, there's a big difference. Okay, what's the question?
The question is about maintaining the Jewish and democratic character of the state of Israel. With the unilateral withdrawal, with IDF in place, and with the use of modern technology, modern military technology, which can pinpoint, how can that perceived threat that some of the participants at these tables have be shown to be less of a threat?
Okay, look. First of all, modern technology is very nice. It only gets you so far. In the end, you need somebody there with a rifle to shoot somebody. The security concerns that were raised here are entirely legitimate. And no one is willing to endanger Israel's security. The question is whether we can put together a security regime, a series of arrangements which are not perfect. Security isn't perfect today when we're in 100% control of, well, not as areas A and B. We're in control of the West Bank today. Security isn't perfect today. When we were in 100% control of Gaza, people forget the rocket fire started not after the disengagement, but before the disengagement. Okay? Now, there is no such thing in life as perfect security. Doesn't exist anywhere, not in the United States either. But if you achieve perfect security, then you have achieved perfect insecurity for your adversary, and the adversary isn't going to live that way. So the question is, national security policy is all about managing risk. Okay? If we didn't have limits, we'd put $100 billion into rocket defense. We don't, so we only put this much into it. We'd have not 1,000 tanks, we'd have 1,000,000 tanks. It's always about managing risk. The question is whether we can manage risk, where we can find security arrangements that are not perfect, they are sufficiently good so that we can implement them with relative confidence, knowing that we've got bad experience. No one's going into this starry-eyed. I'm a member of an organization of just under 300 former IDF generals and their civilian counterparts. I wasn't a general, but I was the equivalent, the civilian equivalent, who all happen to believe we could all be wrong. But 300 generals is a lot of generals. It's most of the former IDF generals alive today who believe that we can find the solution and that the need for it to preserve Israel's character is such that we have to do it. So,
my cousin who just
What's
passed
the name of
away,
the organization?
Commanders for Israeli Security. Your cousin, excuse me?
Who just passed away, Moshe Aaron.
Oh.
I saw on, I don't know whether it was an ISGAP or, not ISGAP, I forgot what was streaming, but there was something where he was being quoted, it was him talking. He said, well, we just have to be patient. And I was thinking where my father's fathers come from, in Poland, the area between Russia and Poland, where 3 million Jews live, for I would say for 1,000 years. My father, Ernie Fine, said they changed the border every single day. One day it was Poland, the next day it was Russia, then it was Poland, then it was Russia. Forget about Lithuania. They just kept on changing the border. And they're still doing that. So we talk about final status and all that. Not going to happen.
You're right. You're right. History is changing all the time. The question is, look, you cannot ensure security forever. I don't know what's going to happen 50 years from now in the Middle East. I don't know what's going to happen 50 days or maybe 50 hours from now. I know one thing. The current situation ensures the demise of what I define as a Jewish and democratic Israel. Now, other people can have different definitions. If somebody thinks that 60-40 is a Jewish state, that's fine. If somebody thinks that you can maintain a permanent occupation over 5 million people and retain your democratic character, even if, by the way, in Israel itself will continue to vote. Israel within its own borders will remain a democratic state. The quality of Israeli democracy is eroded daily by this. And the polarization, the legislation that's been passed in the last year. Israel's still a democracy. It's not quite the democracy it was a year ago. But I don't think we can really remain a Jewish and democratic state with this situation. So let me change, if I can, what I know today. And when we reach the future, not going to do this blindly, but when we reach those junctures in the future, we'll handle them as well.
What do you think of Israel joining NATO as a detriment to Iran?
I think if you're going to talk about an outside guarantee, it's just a bilateral defense treaty with the United States, not NATO. NATO is 28 countries. By the time they meet, talk about anything, and actually reach a decision, which they rarely do, the war will have ended long ago. Yeah, 3 times over, and we may or may not still be there. So There's a question whether Israel might, under certain circumstances, want a bilateral defense treaty with the United States. Cooperation with NATO, definitely, but not an actual treaty. Wait, and someone did ask the question?
How would what you are proposing be implemented in Israel right now? How would it get started?
Well, it requires a change in government.
Like how? Who?
If a new government is elected. If you listen to what Gantz said last week, by the way, he said exactly what I said today, in slightly different words. He said we have to begin taking measures to ensure Israel's Jewish and democratic character. Okay? That's what he said.
That's
It
what
was
you said?
Benny Gantz, former chief of staff. That's what Ehud Barak says, a former chief of staff. That's what all sorts of other chiefs of staff and all sorts of other generals have said over time. You can disagree with them. Generals don't have the answer to everything military. But you can't dismiss it. You have to. You can't dismiss what they're saying just because you disagree with it. Or maybe.
They're building a fence in Gaza. They're building a fence in Gaza now, they said. I mean, it's part of the...
Look, yeah, we're not going to have 100% security with these people. I said before, all right? I believe that's a big issue. If it was me, I would divide Jerusalem tomorrow without thinking.
Wow.
You know why? Because there are 300,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem.
So what?
We have to maintain access, Jewish access to the wall. Access to the wall, there has to be a special arrangement. But people say, oh, Yerushalayim, how can... There are 300,000 Palestinians, do we really need them? So, okay, so we have to find a solution which guarantees us access. The Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem will remain under Israeli control. The Jewish quarter will remain under Israeli control. But
he said if we access the Jerusalem, which I'd love to do, because I don't need those, they would all move to Tel Aviv.
You know something, ma'am, if you want to live in a state of existential anxiety forever, if you want to live on the verge of the Holocaust, being reborn every day, you're welcome to do it. Israel was born to ensure at the end to Jewish insecurity. To ensure Jewish security. We've done that. We've done that magnificently. There is no threat to our existence anymore. And to keep living in this deep fear, everything is terrible. It's not. And not every threat is a major threat. We have to change the situation. Good.
I agree that with the exception, but they wouldn't.
The problem that you put forth is, and the solution with East Jerusalem is, I think a serious one and should be taken seriously. But I want to throw something else in. I just, I don't know about the security but what about the triangle? That would be a good, there's 250.
You're right, they're Israeli citizens. Look, if you ask me when I fall asleep at night and I have my wonderful dreams of the future, are the 1.5 million Israeli Arabs included in that dream? The answer is no. Now let's talk political reality. And the reality is that they are Israeli citizens. They have been for 70 years. They're going to remain Israeli citizens. Most of them want to be integrated into Israeli society, and integration is actually going ahead rather rapidly, rather successfully. When polled, do you want to live in a Palestinian state? Hell no. Hell no. Why would they? Do you support a Palestinian state? Absolutely. Do you want to live? No. Do you want to? No forced expulsion. How about if we just move the line on the map and the triangle? No way. We want to remain part of Israel. Okay. Look, these are real issues. You're raising a real issue. But we can keep raising the problem, and we can keep saying, but the Palestinians this and the Palestinians that. The Palestinians are the most dysfunctional people probably ever born in history. They will get it wrong no matter what. Let's get it right for ourselves. Now, that isn't divorced from them. We don't operate in a vacuum. But let's ensure our own future. Good night. How are we doing time-wise?
I still have a good 10 minutes.
Good.
If there are options as a Palestinian, like Rawati, like development of entrepreneurial exercise, opportunities rather, like the continued cooperation medically between the Gaza hospital and a medical facility within the current West Bank. And I'll go back again to Rawati, which is a city built for 30,000 occupants, 30,000 apartments, which gives a whole different lifestyle, a whole different impetus for the right of return to Palestine.
So what's your question?
Will that be an incentive for peace, for the world nations, the diplomacy of the world, to leave Israel on the good side of the world's balance? And how can that be encouraged?
First of all, the Palestinians today, and again, this is an example of their dysfunction. They are so beyond even being capable of talking about mutually beneficial cooperation with Israel. Students in Israeli and Palestinian students in the United States won't talk to Israeli students. Okay, it's not just that the diplomats can't reach an agreement, they won't even engage in dialogue very often, and I know what I'm talking about. I teach in the US. So first of all, I'm not basing anything on Palestinian willingness for cooperation. You're asking whether it's going to change the international perception. The answer is no. You have to understand, most of the world today believes that Israel, and first and foremost the settlement policy, is responsible for the collapse of the peace process. And they also, it's not just that Israel is the obstacle. What Israel is doing is counterproductive for its own interests. Because if Israel wants to remain a Jewish and democratic state, what is it doing? Why is it settling? Israel is destroying the peace process itself. Now, this is obviously an inaccurate image. People don't remember Camp David. They don't remember the Clinton parameters, and they don't remember the Olmert Initiative. They don't remember Oslo. That's even further back. They don't remember that. What they remember is the settlements. And I don't think that there is almost, I mean, this is discouraging. I don't think there's almost anything that we can do that will change the international perception until we announce a fundamental change in our policy. That won't solve it, but that will go a long way towards doing it. Because if we did it, we transfer the onus to the Palestinians. If we say, yes, we're willing to have a two-state solution, we're willing to withdraw as we were in the past, under Barak, under Olmert, we're willing to withdraw from the overwhelming majority of the West Bank. Now let's talk with the Palestinians. And they refused. No, Netanyahu hinted at it at the Bar-Ilan speech and has backed off it since then. He doesn't say two-state anymore. That will change it. It won't solve our PR problems, our Hasbara problems. They maintain that they changed it. They did change it. Did they really change it completely? Maybe not. So should there be some more changes? We'll insist on some more changes. We're going to insist that they recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, not just its right to exist.
Did you have comments on the national state law, please?
As somebody else who didn't ask yet?
Did you have a question? You didn't get to ask.
Yes, no. I just kind of upset about the school education that these Arabs bring up these children. Kindergarten, birth, they all hate Israel, destroy Israel. It's a terrible thing. They're not going to achieve peace. You have to work on the children. You have to work on the youth. And then maybe take 15 years. Maybe.
Well, first of all, I don't think that 10, 15, 20, or 30 years is going to change it. It is deeply Okay, let's look at things in a little bit more of a
that's it.
A balanced approach. Look at what's happening in Israel today. Look at what's happening in Israel. The level of hatred towards the Palestinians, towards the Arabs in Israel, has increased dramatically. We just had 5 soldiers who have been accused now of brutally beating Palestinians. We've had numerous cases. We have numerous cases of the Tag Mechir, of the price tag, attacks. There was a Palestinian family burned alive last year. Now, I don't want to equate, because here I can name all the cases, and there are thousands of cases. The level of hatred in Israel is increasing. Israeli society is changing, and people who don't want to look the truth in the face. It's not just one-sided. We have to do something about the way we're educating our children as well.
So you don't believe what Bibi said, the only peace that the Arabs will make is with a strong Israel?
Of course.
Yeah,
Of course I believe
they
that.
want Tel Aviv. There's no two ways about it.
They may want Tel Aviv, but we're not giving it to them, so it doesn't matter.
Who decide? You want peace, you want them to get.
I say to you again, if you want to live in existential fear for the rest of your life, do so.
But we are Jews. We always do.
So, assuming that the Palestinians have the West Bank, and the soldiers are there going down, how do you prevent arms from entering the West Bank? Like now in Gaza, we try to control it.
The question was, how do you prevent? The question was, how do you prevent arms from entering the West Bank in the context of a peace agreement? Well, first of all, we maintain control of the border crossings so that we can supervise what goes in and out. This was agreed in Oslo. The Palestinians didn't like it, and the compromise that was worked out at the time was that Israeli security officials would be sitting behind one-way mirrors, and they could see who was coming through.
And underground, too.
And they could say to the Palestinian customs officials, no, that guy can't enter, or that guy, please check him some more. And that worked quite effectively. Now, Tzahal will remain deployed, at least to some extent, along the border. And there will be a variety of additional measures. There will be early warning systems, there may be international forces, there will be a whole variety of measures. And you know something? It's not going to be 100% effective.
Do you think it's possible to have any kind of federation with Jordan?
Federation or confederation with Jordan. The Jordanians aren't going to agree to it, okay? There's no way that they can agree to it if they have a choice. And I think that the Palestinians aren't going to agree to it, if at all, until first they have their own independent state. Then they might have reasons for wanting to be interested in it, but that's probably distant future. Israel doesn't want that. We don't want it for ourselves. For them to do it, yeah, but for ourselves, we don't want it. All right, last question, and then I just want to say one last thing.
Would you comment, please, on the
nation
political positioning vis-a-vis establishing a unilateral choice for a two-state solution and the national state law?
I didn't understand the first part.
Would you comment?
No, that I understood about. What was the first thing you wanted me to comment on?
Is there a relationship between the need to establish a nation-state law that may affect this walk towards a two-state solution?
I think the nation-state law had one objective, and that was to be as provocative as possible, because it didn't change anything in reality. It's one thing, it left out the word equality, but that was intentional, that was part of the provocation. They could have copied the language from the Declaration of Independence, incorporated it in the law, and nobody could have said a word because it wouldn't have changed a thing. They intentionally left that out. But in reality, Israel was a Jewish state. We defined ourselves as a Jewish state. Now we've done it by law. But nothing of substance has changed here. The reason it was done was as a political provocation in preparation for the elections. That's all. They knew they were coming. They didn't, at the time, maybe they didn't know it was going to be April 9th, but they knew it was in the coming months. And this was a good issue for rallying the right-wing base. That's all.
What's your website of the group that you represent?
Commanders for Israeli Security. I don't represent them, I'm a member. I don't represent them.
.org?
Yeah, .com. No, so you're probably right. It's Commanders for Israeli Security.org or .com. Or maybe it's, maybe it's co.il.
Yeah.
That's probably co. Okay. Let me say one last sentence. In many ways, I'm actually happy that this wasn't a friendly crowd in terms of the opinions. I don't mean to push it. Because I think that this is the kind of... I don't want to talk to people who think as I do. That's easy. I don't want to convince the convinced. What I want to do is engage in a dialogue with people who don't think that. That's why I wrote this book. That's why it's the first proposal in Israel's history for a national security strategy. And it's more than legitimate to disagree. But it's not legitimate to disagree without knowing the facts. And I believe that I set them out in great detail in the chapters, in the background chapters, before making the recommendations. Now, believe me, I have no financial interest in selling this book. And if you knew what my royalties are, you'd go home. I do think it's important for people to read it, especially for people like yourselves who have a different perspective. And maybe you're right, but come to the conclusion, I would say, after reading this.
Are you familiar with the New State Solution?
What's a new state?
That's the cyanide business.
That's the cyanide.
That's the proposal. I think.
By a general and, Habibi, I asked about that.
I don't know. I've never heard of General Habibi. It's the Egyptians are not going to agree to it ever, so forget about it. Okay, this is pure fantasy. It's not worth wasting our time. People in 50 years, no one has yet come up with a viable alternative to two states. Maybe that isn't viable either, but no one's come up with a viable alternative. So I think instead of looking for all sorts of ways out of this solution, face it, this is the reality. Now, how do we deal with it? I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards. Thank you all for coming.